Hello, and welcome to Stream of Conscience, the show that celebrates local activism and is brought to you by Democracy for America Fairfield County, a progressive, grassroots political organization that always welcomes new members. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Our guest today is Jim Cameron, a chairman of the Metro-North Rail Commuter Council, an organization that he's served for almost 16 years and has been chair for the last 4. Jim and I actually worked together on the council. I joined 2 years ago. He's from Darien, but originally from Toronto, which is perhaps one of the most transportation-friendly cities in North America.
Indeed it is.
So welcome, Jim. We're glad to have you here on the show.
Good to be here, thanks.
So there's a brouhaha that has been brewing over the Ep8 cars. When I came on the council 2 years ago, we were promised that the cars would arrive by the end of that year, so that would have been 2009, and they were supposed to start testing and go into service relatively quickly thereafter. 18 months later, the first cars finally went into service in the middle of the most awful winter that we have had in a long, long time, during which the number of cars on the rails, of the regular cars, the old cars, had decreased by almost half, and the transportation system in the Northeast Corridor was brought to a halt on several occasions. Not a pretty picture, and I know that there were a lot of commuters out there who were very unhappy. So let's talk about the Ep8s, how we got to where we are, and why we think now that we may have been misled.
Well, the Ep8s are the newest cars that run on the New Haven branch of Metro-North. They were put into process about 5 years ago. It was actually in Governor Rell's first budget address,
right,
following another horrific winter that Hartford, the legislature, finally realized we had to do something about replacing our aging fleet. The old cars that we have on the New Haven line are, in many cases, older than the passengers. Some of them are 35 and 40 years old.
Right.
So the legislature had kicked this can down the road for decades under the Rowland administration, particularly, who didn't want to spend money on infrastructure.
Well, in fact, if I remember correctly, when Rowland came in, one of the first things he wanted to do was to cancel some of the service that was already in place at that time. So
right.
I don't think we can blame simply the legislature for kicking the can down the road. I think the governor at that time was not in favor of transportation in Fairfield County.
Well, he wanted to close down the branch lines particularly,
right,
which are expensive to operate for a number of contractual reasons as well too. But I've been going up to the legislature, testifying in front of the Transportation Committee for years, usually around some bill, using that as an excuse to get up there and bang the drum about new cars. And
right,
the attitude I received from many of the upstate legislators was, you people on the Gold Coast
right,
are all millionaires. You can go
right,
buy your own damn cars. Why are we subsidizing your commute into New York City?
Have they never driven on I-95?
No, they haven't. I mean, if we could make all the legislature's members, ride Metro-North or drive I-95 at rush hour, they'd have a better understanding of what it's like to live in Fairfield County. Remember, 40% of all the tax revenue in the state comes from Fairfield County.
For sure.
And if we don't have good transportation here, people won't live in Fairfield County. They'll live in Westchester or New Jersey or Long Island, and they'll take their tax revenues with them. So new cars were ordered about 2005. It's a long process to
sure,
spec, design, put out to bid, build prototypes.
And our cars are particularly complicated because we have different power sources at different points of the railroad.
That's right. They have to operate under the wire in Connecticut,
right,
and operate on the third rail going into Westchester into Grand Central.
Right.
So they're unique. There's no off-the-shelf rail car you can buy that will run on the New Haven division. Kawasaki won the bid over Bombardier, which had built new cars for the Hudson and Harlem branches of Metro-North.
Okay.
The first cars went through a lot of focus groups. There was a lot of input from the Commuter Council and from others as to how the interiors should look. They were really, I won't say over-designed, but they are extraordinary in their complexity and technology. They are more complicated than Acela, the fast train that Amtrak runs. So the first car did arrive Christmas Eve 2009, and I remember seeing that car, sitting in that car, knee to knee with Governor Rell,
Right.
who had pushed so hard during her administration to get these cars
She certainly had.
in service, and she really wanted to be there to see what those cars looked like. What happened between Christmas Eve 2009 and March 1st of 2011, when the first trains went into service, is really the question. Certainly there is a testing period that has to be done on these cars. They were being tested here on site, unlike earlier cars which were sent out to Colorado, where there's actually a Federal Railroad Administration testing facility, a big loop track where cars are run at high speed and braked and run through water and things like that. So they had to be tested here because our roadbed, our signal system is integral to understanding if these cars can operate.
Of course.
The question is, why did it take so long for these cars to go through the prototype testing and finally get approved?
And on the council, we just heard again and again, oh yes, they're in testing, oh yes, things are going well, oh yes, and they weren't.
Every month we would ask, how are the M8s going?
Yes.
And our minutes reflect the fact that we were basically shined along by Metro North and the DOT and told that, testing continues, you got to be patient, give this stuff time. Well, recently, one of the TV stations in New York got the results of their effort at a Freedom of Information Act request filed back in February, asking for documentation on the testing. And what they received was a treasure trove of emails and letters between Metro North, Kawasaki, and LTK, the consulting firm hired by Metro North to do the testing.
Right.
And while we were being told on the council, and while the public face of Metro North and the DOT were saying the testing continues, we have some, quote, software problems, this documentation proves quite the opposite, that there were serious problems with, in one case, on one night's testing, 150 different things went wrong. Even as recently as January of this year, one of the memos said we have yet to have 1 mile of testing error-free.
And this is very, very important because they could not begin revenue service with these cars until they had run 4,000 miles error-free.
Yes.
So in January, they're saying to themselves, we haven't had any mile that's been error-free. And in March, suddenly, there's some cars that are in revenue service. So I want to know how that happened.
Well, that's the question, and unfortunately the documentation we've got so far doesn't answer that question because the documentation ends sometime in February.
Before the cars rolled out.
Before the cars went into service.
Right.
Now, the rest of that Freedom of Information Act request will be the most interesting because how did these cars go from having 150 errors one night to suddenly going into service? So one of two things happened. Either there was some miraculous cure found for all these problems, or the 4,000 mile testing had some concessions made. Maybe there were some errors that were made that rather than resetting the odometer back to zero and starting again, they said, well, that's something we can fix. Now, since the cars have gone into service March 1st, we now have 3 train sets. They run 6 or 7 trips a day.
As set as 8 cars.
8 cars. One of them I think is 6, so there's a few spares as well too.
Okay.
They haven't had a lot of problems. They've had a couple of incidents of the brakes going on or the doors not closing, but we're very interested, as Metro North is, because they're paying a lot of money for these cars, at following these new cars in their early days of operation.
Now, when you say Metro North's paying for the cars, actually Connecticut is paying for the cars through Metro North.
Right.
And again, like the rails, where we have one sort of electrical system in New York State and another in Connecticut, we also have a very complex management situation here because the Connecticut Department of Transportation is the area from which the money flows, but the control is with Metro North, which controls all of the trains in New York and in Connecticut. So we contract with them.
We hire them. They are a vendor to the state.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, the New Haven division of Metro North is bigger than the rest of its entire operation.
Right.
So the contract work they do for Connecticut is the largest piece of their revenue source. Connecticut pays 2/3 of the cost of these new cars, 1/3 is borne by New York State.
Okay.
So because they do operate in Westchester County and serve.
But they run
New
the
York patrons.
contract, and so when something goes wrong,
Yep.
it's Metro North that's working with Kawasaki and whomever their consultant is. Now, we on the council, briefly, our role is what?
Well, the Commuter Council, as it's known in its short form, the full name being the Metro North Shoreline East Connecticut Rail Commuter Council, is a creation of the state legislature.
Right.
We are celebrating our 25th anniversary.
Right.
And we were created, all of our members being commuters, appointed by various lawmakers, some by the governor, some by the Senate Majority Leader, and others.
Right.
We now have 13 members, and we're all commuters from various towns. We have some commuters from as far away as New London, some from New Canaan, Norwalk, Darien, Westport. The newest member's just been appointed. He commutes from Bethel. And we meet on a monthly basis with Metro North and with the Connecticut DOT. And our mandate is to look out for the interests of our fellow commuters.
Right.
We have no budget. We have no statutory authority beyond requesting and receiving from any state or municipal agency any documentation we want.
And do we get that?
Well, no, we don't. That's part of the problem.
Right.
Now, we didn't file a Freedom of Information Act request for this documentation. Perhaps we should have.
We should have. We didn't think about it.
But, good for Channel 7 for doing that.
Well, they've got lawyers. We don't have a budget for that.
That's true. But what we did do was, at the worst of the winter's crisis in January and February, when the railroad was in meltdown or freeze-up stage, as you mentioned, 40% of the fleet was out of service. They had to cut the timetable,
Right.
combine trains just to keep the railroad going.
Yes.
We held as our February meeting what we called a Winter Crisis Summit.
Yes.
And the commissioner of the DOT was there, representatives of Metro North, not the president, who we had invited, but the statutory authority we have, I invoked, and I said we would like to have a representative at that meeting from Kawasaki, from LTK, because they're doing the testing.
The consultants.
The consultants.
Right.
And said, we've heard from DOT, which really only is told by Metro North what they want them to know.
Right.
And we've heard from Metro North, but let's bring the people in that are doing the testing. We were refused.
Yes.
And when I said, what do you mean we're refused? You can't refuse us. The law says you have to cooperate. The commissioner did nothing. I actually went to Governor Malloy's office through channels and said, tell your commissioner to please abide by the law.
Right.
And they didn't even respond. They didn't give me the courtesy of a reply.
Wow.
So at our meeting, I specifically asked the commissioner, why did you not bring the representatives that we requested?
Yep.
And they said, well, we've brought the people from Metro North who will explain what's going on. And I said, well, that's not what we asked for.
Right.
And the commissioner told us, you're not engineers. You wouldn't understand what the LTK and Kawasaki people would say.
You're not smart enough.
We're not smart enough.
Right.
And at that point, there was actually a commuter in attendance who stood up and he said, I have a doctorate in civil engineering from Columbia University.
Well, I'm probably
Try
smarter
me,
than the rest of you guys. Yeah.
Yeah, try me. Just
Exactly.
let us see what it is.
Yeah.
So I was most angry at, first of all, their refusal to abide by the law,
Yeah.
and second, their condescending attitude
Yes.
that because we weren't engineers, we couldn't understand the complexity of the issues they were addressing.
Now, that was actually an acting commissioner of transportation,
Yes.
who replaced the commissioner of transportation whom Morell had brought in, and then she summarily dismissed last summer for reasons that were never made public, but we don't need to talk about that. The point is that he left. They had an acting commissioner. That one's now gone.
He left shortly after
He
our
left
meeting.
shortly after our meeting.
Yeah.
We now have another acting commissioner,
Right.
Jim Rediker, who is a transportation veteran from New Jersey Transit and knows railroads very well and is a smart guy. The question, though, is what's happening here with DOT? And let me just throw one more thing into the mix, which is that if, as we almost surely will happen, there won't be a budget agreement with the unions. We know that the unions have turned it down. There's maybe they can rescue it. I kind of doubt it. There's going to be layoffs.
Yep.
Transportation, ConnDOT is going to get targeted for that. They have very few people now working on the public transportation side. So where do we go with all of this? I mean, we only have maybe by the end of this year 60 of these new cars
Right.
in place. instead of 100. It doesn't look good.
Well, a number of issues you mentioned.
I did. I'm sorry. I should have kept it one or two at a time.
First.
Right.
Why don't we have a full-time commissioner at the DOT?
Good starting point.
When Malloy was in his transition stage, he had headhunters out looking to fill his cabinet.
Right.
And they have searched far and wide. There's been a national search for a commissioner of DOT.
Yes.
And they haven't found anybody yet, I think, for a couple of reasons. One, the job doesn't have a lot of longevity. The other problem is that Connecticut is one of only 2 states in the country that operates its commuter rail and bus service out of its DOT, Maryland being the other. Every other state, the Department of Transportation is really the highway department.
Yep.
So to find somebody with national experience on both the highway and the rail side is very difficult.
And I think historically it would be the case that the highway department here has been the lead in the Connecticut Department of Transportation.
One of the reasons I think Metro North operations have been given short shrift is that it has been, until the last 2 commissioners, full commissioner, really a highway department running a train operation as well too.
Right. And
now, the other
the busiest corridor in the country, if not the world.
The busiest commuter railroad in North America.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, the Malloy budget, I'm told as of reporting today, is going to require something like 825 layoffs in the DOT itself.
Ouch.
There aren't that many people working on the rail side that I think those cuts will happen there. There's a lot of people who maintain the highways, run lawnmowers up the medians. I would expect if those cuts are going to be made, they'll probably come more from the highway side. But it's the commissioner's job to find those cuts.
Right.
And at least we've got an acting commissioner who is sympathetic to rail, came from the rail operations side, and realizes that the cuts can't happen there. The other question is, in addition to personnel cuts, will there be service cuts? And I have, my fears are that they will again look at cutting service, not completely, but perhaps on the branch lines, perhaps some off-peak service on the main line as well too.
Right. And then we know there's going to be a fare increase. It was statutorily. Thank you very much. Statutorily demanded as part of the deal under Governor Rell when these cars were originally funded. And in fact, that fare increase was supposed to have taken place a year and a half ago, but then the cars were supposed to have been here a year and a half ago when they got here. So, Governor Rell held off on that fare increase, and nobody actually challenged her because the law said you had to have a fare increase. But anyway, she didn't. They need, if I remember correctly, 6 months or so of run-up in order to get that fare increase in position. We're told that the fare increase is going to take place the 1st of January, which means that they need to start that public process immediately. And we're looking at, taking employees away and decimating the department. I don't know if they're going to have people out there actually who can run a series of fare increase hearings. It's a real mess.
We're talking about 1.5% fare increase January 1st of 2012. Another 1% each of the January 1st for the next 6 years.
Right.
A small fare increase, and if we were actually riding in these new M8 cars with any frequency, I don't think anybody would mind.
Exactly.
Compared to our brethren in New York State, which have seen double-digit fare increases back to back in the last year, we're still doing pretty well. Although the fares on Metro North in Connecticut are among the highest commuter rail fares in North America.
Because they get the lowest subsidy.
Because they have the lowest subsidy, yes.
Yeah, right. Well, so we're going to get some M8 cars. We've got some now. We're promised to have 60 by the end of this year.
Right.
We're promised at that point to be in a production schedule of 10 a month.
Right.
Governor Malloy also in February or March, I can't remember which, had the bonding commission go ahead and bond the remainder of the cars that were out there. They had an option for 80 above the original 300. So we're going to get 380 cars. It's going to take several years for that to happen. Now, at the end of all of that, if I remember the math, there's going to be like a 20% increase in the capacity of the rail line, assuming that there's not any sort of service cuts because we're running out of. So my question there is, where are those people going to park?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, we're increasing the capacity of this railroad.
Yes.
But the DOT, which owns and operates, or owns at least, and lets the towns operate most of the stations and their adjacent parking lots, has done bupkis. They've done nothing to increase parking along the line. So if we're increasing the capacity of that service, people can't take the train if they can't get to the train station.
Well, there is a new station that's supposed to come online later this
Fairfield.
year in Fairfield.
Right.
And there are over 1,000.
1,400 spaces.
Yeah, 1,400 spaces.
Yeah.
So that'll be nice. But Stanford is a mess.
Stanford is a mess for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that the old parking lot that's there has been slated for demolition for the last 4 years.
Right.
And the question has been, DOT wants to, well, maybe we could use that real estate to put up some sort of an office building and move the parking away from the train station.
Right.
Over our dead bodies,
Indeed.
said the Commuter Council.
Yes.
And even if they do replace that parking lot in place, it's going to be an ungodly mess for a couple of years because it's tight quarters. They have to demolish the old lot, which is pretty much contiguous with the new lot. Do that without disrupting
the new lot wraps around the old lot.
It
Yeah,
does.
so they would have to take down the old one, rebuild that.
Right.
And in the meantime, that's like a 2-year job. And so they're trying to find satellite lots. They would have to run buses. By the way, that's all very expensive, and I don't know where the money would come from for that. There was money that the legislature had put aside. They tried to use it for one thing. The legislature said, no, you can't do that.
Yeah.
So there isn't any real vision here, and there certainly isn't a lot of cooperation between the legislature and ConnDOT and Metro North and the towns, and it's just, it's a real problem.
And the parking waiting list at most of the stations in southern Fairfield is 4 or 5 years. Many of the people that have the permits who waited that period don't use them on a regular basis.
Right.
So there are empty spaces in the permit lot. The day parking spaces are full up. Many of the towns, Westport, for example, now sells twice as many permits as they have spaces.
And they still have a 5-year waiting list.
And Darien is similar to that. So we've been talking about doing something to either increase the parking capacity or manage the demand. And it may be, I've suggested, let the marketplace decide what these spaces are worth. Let's have a Dutch auction, the first space going to the highest bidder. So if the average permit is $350 a year, there's someone who will say, I'll spend $500, and the next person $450, and work your way down. But let the marketplace decide how much those spaces are worth.
I think we need to do another show just on parking.
We could.
Yeah, we definitely could.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for coming out today.
My pleasure.
And Metro North Rail Commuter Council meets every month.
Yes.
We're on the third Wednesday of the month, I believe.
That's right. And you can just Google Metro North Commuter Council.
Right.
You'll find our website.
Yep.
Links to all of our minutes, information about the work that we have
We'll certainly
done.
put up the URL so
Good.
that people can find that. Generally, we meet at 7 o'clock in the Government Center in Stamford on the 3rd floor, and everyone is welcome to come.
And we encourage commuters to either attend in person or reach to us through email if you can't attend.
We have a Facebook page.
We do. We have a Twitter account.
We got it all.
And if you have questions, complaints, ideas, please use our good offices because we can get you answers.
Terrific. And now here's Ann Galloway with our Stream of Conscience book review. This week we're looking at Wendell Potter's Deadly Spin. An insurance company insider speaks out on how corporate PR is killing healthcare and deceiving Americans.
Formerly a communications executive for one of the nation's largest health insurers, Wendell Potter now is a senior analyst at the Center for Public Integrity and a senior fellow on healthcare at the Center for Media and Democracy. Deadly Spin tells of Potter's experiences at the highest levels of the healthcare industry, where his job was to promote disinformation. However, he became so disturbed about the lies he was being highly paid to promote that he left his job and told the story. In 2009, Potter disclosed to a Senate committee how insurance companies have forced millions of Americans into the ranks of the uninsured. He also described how the insurance industry developed a communication strategy based on deception to defeat or weaken healthcare reform. Potter's book begins with a quotation from Alex Carey, an Australian writer and social psychologist who pioneered the study of corporate propaganda. The 20th century has been characterized by three developments of great political importance: the growth of democracy, the growth of corporate power, and the growth of corporate propaganda as a means of protecting corporate power against democracy. This book is as much about public relations as it is about healthcare. Deceptive practices corrupt public debate and policy in many industries, but Potter says that healthcare offers a particularly egregious example. The term medical loss ratio surfaced in our recent healthcare debate. This term applies to money paid out in medical claims, which insurance companies treat as a loss. So to keep stock prices up and satisfy Wall Street, insurance companies find creative ways to deny reimbursement or to drop coverage entirely if a patient files too many claims. In a section of the book, which he calls Bernie Madoff Should Have Been an Insurer, Potter explains that insurance commissioners lack the authority to intervene, and most state legislatures have taken a passive approach because health insurers are large employers. And in every state, they also happen to be among the biggest spenders on lobbying and campaign contributions. Potter says, if you are among those who believe that the United States has the best healthcare system in the world, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, it's because my fellow spinmeisters and I succeeded brilliantly at what we were paid very well to do with your premium dollars. In fact, the U.S. ranks 47th in life expectancy at birth, behind Bosnia, and 54th behind Bangladesh in fairness. And if you were persuaded that the healthcare reform bill President Barack Obama signed into law in March 2010 was a government takeover of the healthcare system, my former colleagues and I earned every penny of our handsome salaries, not to mention our bonuses. So given his handsome compensation, the question is why Potter chose to walk away from a cushy job and essentially become a whistleblower. First of all, he learned about the death of a young girl who was denied a transplant that could have saved her life. He also visited a rural site close to where he grew up, seeing people with no coverage lined up to receive free treatment in horse stalls. Potter also saw firsthand how the industry colluded to minimize the impact of Michael Moore's film Sicko. The same public relation firms that served the tobacco and fossil fuel industries with their disinformation campaigns applied a full-court press against Michael Moore. Potter says even promises made directly to President Obama during the recent healthcare negotiations were lies. While the resulting legislation will expand coverage and control some costs, it doesn't include a government-run public option to compete with private insurers who will benefit handsomely from mandated enrollment. I'd give it a C. Wendell Potter actually apologized publicly to Michael Moore on Countdown. And I wonder if this apology may have contributed to Keith Olbermann's departure from MSNBC. There are risks for speaking the truth to power. This has been a Stream of Conscience book review. I'm Ann Galloway. Thanks for watching.
That's our show for this week. We hope you enjoyed it. If you live in the town served by Cablevision in Norwalk, you can catch our show every Wednesday at 8 p.m. on Channel 88. And if you're interested in learning more about progressive political action in Fairfield County, please check out our website, Democracy for America, Fairfield County. We meet the first Wednesday of the month, 7 to 9 p.m. in the Silver Star Diner in Norwalk, and we always welcome new members. So remember, change is possible, and you can make it happen. This has been Stream of Conscience. I'm your host, John Hartwell. Thanks for joining us. Hope to see you again soon.